So this video is going to be on the abuse of the mental health field by individuals and also by groups, particularly whoever is running the organized stalking program. We know that in the past, not only the mental health field, but also, doctors and therapists of all kinds were recruited into the MK Ultra program to experiment on patients. Whether that's happening again, I don't know. But what I know for sure, as many of you do, is that the mental health system is being weaponized. And we're going to talk about that today. I tried to make this video one thing after another, and I just had to continue stopping and starting and stopping and starting. I just deleted the entire thing. It was garbage. So we're going to try this again all the way through. If I talk fast, it's just because this video is so long. I don't want you guys to be here for hours. Okay, but one thing before we begin, just remember this. The unrighteous will seek to create as much suffering as possible. Those who feign righteousness will attempt to silence those who suffer in order to pretend that nothing is wrong. They will even blame those who cry out in pain for the disharmony in society, instead of placing the blame on the abusers. But the righteous, the truly righteous, will seek to ease pain by putting an end to whatever is causing the suffering. Remember that as we go on. Here we go, as fast as possible. During World War II, the Nazis began to develop a method of psychological warfare to be used not only against the Jewish population, but also against ethnic Germans who opposed the Nazi regime. Later, starting in the 1950s, the East German Stasi, or Stasi, honed in on this new method of attack, using it against anyone who opposed the communist regime in East Germany. Now, before anyone mentions this again, I understand that the Germans are not a communist people, that this was imposed on them by an outside force. Okay? I know that. Moving on. The Stasi, police for the German Democratic Republic, fought opposition by overt and covert measures, including covert, hidden, psychological destruction of dissidents, something that was later called Zersetzung, literally meaning decomposition. This finally ended in 1990, or so we were led to believe. This type of warfare involved infiltrating the lives of targets, defaming them, creating false files on them, and in this manner, they recruited friends, family, and community members in order to help track the target's every move. Okay, they used illegal surveillance, they performed illegal entry into the homes of the targets, in attempts to drive the targets crazy by entering their homes, moving stuff around, leaving a window open. In our case, they left a window open and they turned a clock back too. Let me see. And other actions that, when reported to the cops, seems so crazy that the targets were deemed insane for believing that such things would ever happen. In the end, many targets were deemed insane by crooked psychiatrists. They were labeled insane by crooked psychiatrists for complaining about things that were actually happening. And the community members who knew that the targets were being labeled mentally ill and even institutionalized for speaking about things that were actually happening, never opened their collective mouth to tell the truth and clear the targets of the massive false diagnosis of mental illness that was waged against them. And this is warfare. This is why I'm using this terminology. This is the mental health system has been weaponized, right? And the people who knew that this was happening because they were involved, they never spoke up. They never cleared the names of the targets. They never said that, they never admitted that they did this, even though they knew the targets were being labeled mentally ill for complaining about these things. Now, yeah, so here, let me just finish reading this. So instead, they allowed the targets to be stuck with a false mental illness diagnosis and even congratulated themselves on their effort to put away people who were thought of as so very ill. Some of them were really too stupid to understand what they were doing, or that they had helped set up the targets for a false mental illness diagnosis. In this manner, the Stasi was able to discredit and get rid of anyone who opposed communism. This entire program was denied, and all those who complained about this type of attack were labeled mentally ill until eventually the sick program was exposed and the files were open. Here in America, during the Civil Rights era, the FBI ran a similar program called COINTELPRO, which is short for Counterintelligence Program. This was a covert and oftentimes illegal program aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic political organizations. It was aimed mainly at groups that were considered subversive or a threat to the current order of things, such as human rights organizations, black liberation groups, women's rights groups, anti-war activists, patriots, constitutionalists, and so on. All right. If libertarians were outspoken and vocal back then, they probably would have been targeted too. Although this program supposedly ended in the 1970s when civilian activists found a way to prove what was taking place, some of the tactics used in the original program are still used today by various groups and organizations. Some of these tactics include infiltration, smear campaigns against individuals and groups, false reports, harassment, public humiliation, defamation, and character assassination without giving the target a chance to defend himself or herself, discrediting of the target through psychological warfare, real attempts to drive the target legitimately crazy, all right? Or to a mental breakdown so that the target ends up discrediting himself or herself. Wrongful imprisonment, wrongful institutionalization, and violence, including assassination. Their agenda was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the targeted individual. And by expose, I don't mean to expose anything the target actually did wrong. I mean to make public the false case, the false files, the false accusations that were against the target, that were being used against the target. And then, of course, there was MK Ultra. I didn't write this down, but let me get this in really quick, which consisted of horrific mind control experiments committed by the CIA against unwilling participants. And they got many businesses across America and Canada, including universities and hospitals, to go along with this. So who's to say that that can't happen again? And sometimes this really does feel like an experiment. So we'll see. Some people believe this is a combination of... Hang on. I'm sorry, I had to stop and restart again. This might happen more than once throughout this video. Hopefully, I'll be able to get through this without that happening again. Right, so today, organized stalking, also referred to as gang stalking, is a newer term used to describe a set of attacks similar to those used during the East German attack on dissidents, as well as the FBI's COINTELPRO attack on civil rights activists. And two, it's some of the tactics seem to be similar to those used during MK Ultra, especially the involvement of medical personnel. Okay. It is a discrediting campaign waged against an individual or group in the form of psychological warfare that combines community mobbing and organized stalking. Added to this is a massive amount of slander about the targeted individual, as well as a denial of the target's constitutional rights to be informed of the accusations against him or her, and to be allowed a defense. Like Zerzatsung and COINTELPRO, this type of warfare is being denied by those in charge, and anyone who speaks about it is deemed mentally ill. The media is also responsible for latching onto the mental illness accusation and spreading it like wildfire. And at this level, mental illness is used as an accusation, as those who are deemed mentally ill stand to lose many of their freedoms and rights, and are also completely discredited so that when they seek help for abuse and for attacks, they're not believed. I mean, consider how dangerous that is. The goal of organized gang stalking is to silence the targeted individual, to isolate him or her from every community he or she enters, to in fact have the community drive the target out, and in the end, the ultimate goal is to drive the target insane and thereby discredit him in that manner, have him institutionalized, imprisoned, or drive the target to suicide. And many community members are unwittingly used for this, right? They're told to follow the target around and make certain comments and make certain gestures and then deny doing it, right? And even when they learn that the target could be accused of mental illness for saying that these things are happening, they still will not admit the truth. So even if they start out unwittingly, they don't realize that they're involved in a crime. Once they're made aware of it and they still refuse to tell the truth, at that point they are criminals. They're no longer innocent. If they're going to remain silent and allow someone to be accused of mental illness for pointing out the reality of something that is actually happening, well, how evil is that? And two, do they really want to silence us? I don't know. Sometimes it feels that way, but at the same time, they want us to know they're targeting us. And it's kind of like a physical beating. The more the more they physically beat someone, the more that person is going to scream. They're making it harder and harder to remain silent. So, and even, public outburst, they want to drive the target to public outburst, and they send the perpetrators to provoke and provoke and provoke until the target finally reacts negatively and is then reported for that and condemned for that response. Okay, it's a setup, it's entrapment. Organized stalking involves old methods of warfare taken to a new deadly extreme via use of modern technology. For example, it is easier now than ever to track someone wherever they go, to surveil them illegally by placing cameras and recorders in their home or by hacking their computer and or phone and accessing not only emails but also the internal camera and mic on the computer or cell phone. In the past, the initial notice the stalker would send to his victim might be a piece of paper left on her bed where he lets her know that he can see her, or that he knows where she is, or something like that. But now that notice might be delivered live. Okay, that notice might come from commenters in a chat room online, random people typing out the food she is eating right at that moment, the television program she is watching, or the verbal comment she made to someone who is in her room with her, what she is wearing, etc. Yet to others in the chat room, this looks like nothing more than random trolls, or it looks like people who are just making irrelevant comments that seem to come out of nowhere and make no sense but aren't particularly harmful. There is no way for this woman or man to prove that these random troll comments pertain to her, and stating that she believes this to be the case might earn her the title of narcissist or even paranoid delusional. And for sure, any mention that she thinks there might be hidden cameras in her home will bring on accusations of paranoia if her initial complaints haven't already. This type of attack creates a perfect crime without much evidence, as the targets will most likely be called mentally ill if they are unable to prove without a doubt that someone has them under illegal surveillance and wants them to know it. And even if they have proof, oftentimes that evidence will be used against them by individuals who, instead of looking to get at the truth, are simply trying to prove what they already believe or what they want to believe. Especially if someone already has an agenda, or who knows, is being paid off, they're going to form their conclusion to coincide with whatever supports that agenda. Okay? Simply stating that someone is listening to me in private or watching me in private will not convince law enforcement or psychiatrists that a person is being spied on. It will more likely lead to the assumption that the person is paranoid. Worse still, providing evidence that this type of thing happens all the time and showing proof in the way of news clips speaking about this happening to others will most likely do no good either, if a psychiatrist with an agenda or just a stupid one is on call all the time. He will simply claim that because you saw this happen to someone else, you think that it's happening to you. Mass hysteria. Worse still, in many cases, targets of extremely abusive covert crimes, especially where a lot of gaslighting is involved, will refrain from speaking up about the worst parts of it, or about any of it at all, for fear of being labeled mentally disordered and thus losing all credibility. If at any point more people begin to speak up about the same type of attacks, the person who vowed to never speak about such a thing might actually speak up, believing that there is strength in numbers, and that with this many people reporting the very same type of attack, they are bound to be believed. Sadly, this has proven to be untrue, as certain psychiatrists with nefarious agendas simply use the large number of people reporting the same type of attack as proof that the attack isn't happening, and that people are only repeating what they hear from others, like an echo chamber. Now, I understand what mass hysteria is and what, I understand what that is, and of course it happens. Of course it happens. But when that is used as a default explanation anytime a large group complains about something that seems a little, that's not common, now we're headed to trouble. Now this is counterproductive. At this point, the psychiatrist is nearing the point of a flat-out defamation against the target of these crimes, altering the target's own motives, agenda, and even mental process. He's also, in many cases, psychiatrists reverse the order of events, right? Which came first? The person's agitation, or, and paranoia, or the attacks. He might even ignore evidence that gets in the way of what he wants to believe, or she. Psychiatrists during the East German regime have recently spoken about how when they were in charge of their patients, they diagnosed many with mental illness, though now they can see that they were wrong. Yet back then, when it was all taking place and they were exposed to communist propaganda, they could not separate themselves mentally from that propaganda. And so they actually believed that what they were doing was right. Folks, nothing has changed. If a psychiatrist is educated to believe that, for example, taking a piss every morning at the same time is a sign of mental illness, and that everyone who does this is severely mentally ill, then that psychiatrist will deem as mentally ill everyone who does it, and he will think that he did nothing wrong. It is only when this insane pseudoscientific theory is finally put to rest that these same psychiatrists will look back and realize how insane, stupid, and unscientific such a theory really was. But while it is still popular, most psychiatrists will not be able to see past popular belief. They are no better than the masses in cases such as this, which is a shame because they have an immense amount of power over the lives of ordinary people, as they can literally destroy a person with one false diagnosis. Right? Their diagnosis gets sent, especially if it's bad, it gets shared with law enforcement and government agencies and pretty much everyone, doctors' offices. This can destroy a person. Consider how much power these shrinks have. Right? But back to targets of extreme covert stalking, gaslighting, and other forms of psychological warfare. In this case, you're damned no matter what you do. If you don't have enough proof, of course you won't be believed. If you try to prove your case by at the very least showing that this type of thing does happen, that people get hacked and surveilled all the time, a psychiatrist with wicked intent can simply use that against you as well. Nothing short of catching the criminal in the act or recording him screaming through your speakers will convince anyone that anything at all is happening. And when it comes to crimes like organized stalking, the criminals take extra care to avoid outwardly incriminating themselves or to leave proof that they try not to leave any proof for the target to use. That's why we call it covert, even though the target knows what's going on. It's overt in the sense that they want the target to know about it, but it's covert in the sense that it's very hard to prove and other people aren't going to see it. At some point, the level of sheer deceit that must be used in order to deny outright that any part of this exists borders on criminal intent to hide and or deny evidence. To deny that this type of crime is taking place, one must also deny the reality of stalking, group and mob harassment, illegal surveillance, or that perverts oftentimes place hidden cameras in private areas such as bathrooms or a bedroom. The ability of someone to track another person via GPS or another tracking device. The ability to gather large groups together in one location via social media, as well as the ability to give them real-time instructions, including instructions on how to interact with the target, what to say, what to do, what gestures to make, and so on. Intent. The intent of psychopaths to use everything available in order to harass another human being, right? In reality, to deny that this intent exists among the worst criminals out there is also a complete denial of human nature. Right? A psychiatrist should know this. A psychiatrist knows what sociopathy is. A psychiatrist knows what psychopathy is and what sadism is. They know this exists. All right? Why would anyone assume that the worst of these monsters would not use whatever technology is available to them to harass and torment other people? Heinous crimes have always been committed by sadistic, amoral psychopaths. Modern technology has given those monsters a means of taking their attacks to a whole new level. Anyone who denies this is either stupid or intentionally lying. Remember, psychiatrists are human. They will be subject to whatever beliefs and biases they learn from their own mentors and their own teachers and the government and so on. If they are taught that something isn't real, they are likely to believe that such a thing isn't real, no matter how much evidence is presented to them. Especially in a situation where modern technology has surpassed both the law as well as understanding from the common man as to how it works, how it can be used, and of course, the endless ways in which it can be abused. Although the technology that it takes to commit a lot of these crimes, we already have, cell phones, miniature cameras, and spyware. This is not unheard of. At some point, denial of these things, a person would either have to be stupid or lying. Because the attacks are committed in a covert manner and not much is said about it openly, targets have resorted to explaining as best they can in their own words what is taking place. The very name organized gang stalking is an umbrella term coined by the victims of this sick game in order to give a label to a specific set of attacks that they are experiencing. Many targets, myself included, have complained about the specific attacks that now fall under the term organized stalking long before we ever heard the term or knew such a thing existed. Some psychiatrists will claim that targets only began talking about being targeted after they read of other people being targeted, and thus that it's some form of mass hysteria. This is poor reasoning, as it reverses the order of events and tries to turn proof of a serious crime into proof that the crime doesn't even exist. Most targets knew they were being stalked and harassed long before they ever heard of organized stalking or read from other people who experienced the same thing. When they began researching into this type of harassment, meaning being followed and harassed by mobs of people, they discovered an entire community of people complaining about the same thing, and they discovered that it has a name. It is at this point that these people began using the terminology that we now use today. The community gave a name to the harassment taking place, and targets now use those names in order to explain what has been happening to them all along. Not the other way around. It might also be said by a few extremely manipulative psychiatrists that people who complain about such things simply have an overactive imagination. These psychiatrists then use the fact that many self-professed targets are well read on the subject, and in fact on many subjects that can either be seen as science fiction or science fact, and that because of this, they are simply carrying their quote-unquote fantastical obsessions over into reality. Both of these attempts to try and discredit targets are especially destructive, as it renders targets unable to even research topics that might be relevant to what is happening to them, without the risk of having that research used in order to discredit them. Because as soon as they pick up a book or watch a movie that has some theme similar to what they're complaining about in real life, their complaints are brushed off due to their interest in such topics, instead of the truth, which is that their interest in such topics was spawned from the fact that they're going through these things and are looking everywhere they can for an explanation. This really is an attempt to prevent targets from researching anything regarding this issue. It's quite a manipulative tactic to try and not only silence targets, but also to keep them in the dark as to what's happening to them by frightening them into not even picking up a book to read, to pick up a relevant book to read about. When it comes to someone who just doesn't want to believe that this type of crime exists, nothing a target says or does will convince the person. If you have no proof, they won't believe you. If you have proof, they use it against you. When presenting to someone evidence that a specific crime is common and happening to many people, and they use that evidence to try and discredit you on the grounds that you only think it's happening to because you read about it and because it's happening and you think it's happening to others, well, there's no way you can prove what's happening. And that's the point. Worse, though, are the perpetrators of organized stalking who pretend to be targets of it, and under that facade, they create elaborate and insane stories as to who is doing the stalking and why. Obviously, when the majority of people hear stories involving, giant alien shrimp from a far-off planet, their first reaction is to denounce the entire thing, along with all who complain about being targeted. Most people don't consider that both fact and fiction can be present in the same paragraph, and that just because a certain idea is presented in an insane and obviously fictional manner, it doesn't mean that the essence of the idea itself is false or doesn't exist. Whoever is behind organized stalking understands human nature and that most people will either accept all or none of a statement. If something included in a statement seems too far-fetched, the reader or listener will discount everything said, even information that could be valid. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of targets come from all walks of life. Some are religious, some aren't. Some do believe that an evil supernatural force is behind this, and others believe that the only evil behind this sick program is coming from humans. Some believe it's both. I believe it's probably both. But many targets do end up, at least for a while, trying to convince themselves that there is a greater purpose to this, that somehow this is not all happening to them for nothing, that their suffering is not in vain. Being a target of organized stalking is so demoralizing, dehumanizing even, that many targets will try to find some spiritual cause. And that usually means seeing themselves as good and godly, of course, and of course under attack by the opposite, which would be demonic in nature. Some targets, myself included, even started reading the book of Psalms because the targeting we are experiencing is very similar to what King David went through. Only worse, given the technology that exists today. Placing ourselves in a biblical role and convincing ourselves that we are somehow special and of course, that's why we're quote unquote chosen, makes an otherwise unbearable situation a little more bearable. I personally do believe there is a spiritual element to this, and I won't hide that belief. Yet I also know there is real technology being used, and that humans are doing this. Maybe they are being influenced by some evil force, but they still have the ability to choose and to refuse to take part. Many of them do this because they enjoy it. They enjoy the power it gives them over helpless individuals who can't fight back. And that, I believe, is Satan or the evil inclination influencing their actions. And two, maybe some people don't have a choice. If there are governments doing this, maybe some people are being threatened or intimidated into it. And then there's the more advanced technology, which I won't get into today, which could, on some level, be taking away choices, be limiting free will to some extent. I won't get into that right now. Either way, psychiatrists could take a very understandable phenomena, okay, and instead turn it into delusions of grandeur, right? Oh, you believe you're a god? No, no. But you believe you're a biblical faith? No, no. Right? Instead of looking at this in terms of psychology, why, when someone is being put through hell, wouldn't it be easier for them to try to find something positive in that, to connect it to something positive for them, than to just continue believing that it's for nothing, or worse, that maybe they're bad and that it's being done to them because somehow they deserve it, which many of them are being told. I mean, come on. Any psychiatrist should understand that, at least that much. All that said, there are many victims in this sick game, many people chosen for target practice, and while most don't have a clue as to who started this or why, many have come to their own conclusions. Some have even given titles to the people involved in order to explain or describe the roles that these people are playing. Before I learned about organized stalking, I called the people attacking me on foot lackeys. And I gave the title of organizers to the people I believed to be behind this, giving orders to the lackeys, because it became clear that yes, these people were following me, but they were taking directions from someone else. Someone who was, of course, a coward who, of course, was hiding. Now that I've learned the terminology, I try to use the same terms as other targets, just so that we can understand each other. So now I call the people attacking me perpetrators, though I still call those behind this organizers. We are trying to give labels to individuals who are otherwise passing through society unnamed. To unmask a criminal who walks through society wearing many faces is no easy feat, and whoever is running this sick program is hiding behind many people, many faces, an infinite number of identities. That said, the labels given to these criminals by the targeted individuals might not be their proper professional titles, but they will give people an idea of the role each person plays in the sick game that we call organized stalking. And again, they allow us to communicate with each other using the same language, so to speak, so that we can understand each other. Sadly, this attempt to give names to something whose real name we are unaware of has given crooked individuals, including some psychiatrists, yet another reason to try and discredit us by claiming that we are simply repeating what we heard from others and that we're even using the same terminology. They use that as proof then of their original claim that is mass hysteria, right? We must remember psychiatrists and other mental health workers are human. Like the rest of us, they are likely to be affected by researcher bias, peer pressure, and even their own ego. Being imperfect human beings, they are prone to error. The problem comes when they refuse to admit the truth of the matter, when they simply cannot, for whatever reason, admit to making a mistake. Or worse, one who cannot see past the conditioning of his or her peers in order to wake up and realize that something is wrong in what he or she is being taught. And again, I go back to the psychiatrists from East Germany. Another example was there was a psychiatrist who, during the war on anti-communist activists in East Germany, went along with what she was taught. And so she diagnosed many sane people with mental illness, writing their lives away with a false diagnosis. And she didn't even realize she was doing it, or that she was doing anything wrong. It was only later, when communism ended and the wall fell, that her peers woke up and everyone's views changed, that her own views finally changed as well, and she was able to look back at her former work and realize she had been wrong. Pity that she couldn't wake up while the crime was still happening and while East Germany was still in the clutches of communism, and maybe be a voice for the innocent people who were being falsely diagnosed with mental illness in order to discredit them and in some cases lock them in mental wards. Again, this is psychiatry and psychology and the mental health system being weaponized. This is why I refer to it as an accusation of mental illness. Or if it would have been too risky for her to speak up, she could have at the very least refrained from helping the communist regime. She could have refrained from doing it, from helping them, by simply not diagnosing people with mental illness. She could have just let them go, free and clear of any mental health diagnosis and stigma. Sadly, like most other imperfect human beings, she could not see the error in the propaganda she was being fed until after the propaganda ended and the mindset of the masses as a whole changed. But at least she was honest about it after the fact, and she admitted the mistakes that she made. Most never do. They simply continue on and regurgitate the new beliefs as if they had known such all along, even if only a little while ago they fought against those new beliefs that they're now claiming they knew all along, of course. Liars. And you consider when you consider how much power they have, or to scribble away someone's life with a mental health diagnosis, you would expect more from them than that. You would expect them to be honest, at least first with themselves, first and foremost. But especially if they realize they made a mistake, to admit it, instead of moving forward and just, hoping everyone will forget. And then not even clearing the names of the people that they diagnosed with mental illness falsely. While an imperfect psychiatrist is expected because they're human, one who intentionally deceives himself or herself, while an imperfect psychiatrist is expected, one who intentionally deceives himself or others is unacceptable, given how much power they have over others. Okay, we can expect that they're not going to be perfect, but it is unacceptable for them to intentionally deceive. Researcher bias is not okay in this field, especially if it's intentional. A psychiatrist can scribble away the lives of innocent and sane men, women, and children. Yes, they have that much power. One false diagnosis can destroy a person, affecting his or her life on every level, especially in our current climate with red flag laws and with individual case files shared throughout the government and law enforcement, as the government now demands that doctors run certain assessments and hand over the results to the government. Consider how much power one psychiatrist has. Okay? They have to be held up to the highest standard possible. The more power they have, the more responsibility they have. The patient assessment that the doctors are given typically involves a set of questions meant to determine if the individual is a risk to himself or others, and whether he or she might have some form of mental illness. The problem is that many of the signs and symptoms being presented to mental health professionals as possible indicators of mental health problems are also symptoms of extreme trauma and PTSD, especially when it comes to psychological abuse and gaslighting. The government is doing this on purpose, conditioning mental health professionals and others to be triggered by certain words or phrases such as "I am being followed." They are taught to right away see this as a possible, if not probable, sign of paranoia, instead of taking seriously the target's claim of being followed. Can you imagine how dangerous this is, and how many victims of crimes such as stalking and harassment will never be freed from their abusers, because the very people who were sent to help them are conditioned to believe that this is all in their head? There's a saying in the mental health field, and I think it's in the law profession as well. If you're walking in Central Park and hear hoofbeats, assume horses, not zebras. This is based on the Occam razor principle, where the most obvious possibility is assumed to be true. The most obvious and likely possibility is assumed to be true. Unfortunately, this is not always the case in real life. Sometimes there really are zebras. And so when a person complains about being followed, having his or her home invaded, being watched and listened to in private, and so on, the first conclusion come to by mental health professionals is that the target is suffering from paranoid delusions, and not that this might actually be real. The only people who benefit from this are the abusers. And if that be the government, ours, or another, so be it. They're benefiting from this. And just as with MK Ultra, they're feeding this information to medical professionals so that the medical professionals then, use these standards they judge the patients by these standards, but the standards are false. And it takes an intelligent person in order to be able to see past that. And it takes a lot of bravery to stand up against it. Here's the thing. In our climate, there is no excuse for researcher bias. There's no excuse for failing to accept the reality that this type of warfare There's no excuse for failing to accept the reality of this type of warfare, that it actually exists. With technology today, criminals with wicked intent can get away with actions that seem almost supernatural. Yet when the victims complain, they're called mentally ill. Because it sounds supernatural, and they don't, the psychiatrists don't believe in the supernatural. Therefore, the assumption is the patients are mentally ill. Instead of, any notion that this might actually be happening. In fact, belief in the supernatural is one factor that mental health professionals are told to look out for, including belief in psychic abilities and ESP and so on. Thus, when a target complains that he is being followed and tracked everywhere by people who can hear him in his own home and appear to be omniscient, the mental health professional will right away link this to delusions of supernatural or to magical thinking, and thus assume that the target has a mental health problem, even if the target did not literally mean that something with omniscient powers is following him or her around, but simply that this is what it feels like, meaning he's trying to find a way to describe what this experience feels like. It won't matter. It's already too late. He said omniscient, and that is all it took. The mental health worker has now been triggered by his use of the word omniscient and is now quickly typing out his diagnosis, or hers. Mental health workers are taught to look out for certain words, certain language, and to connect such to possible mental health issues. This makes it almost impossible for victims of extreme trauma to speak about their experiences or even report the abuse without being classified as mentally ill. Right? Even something like the Truman Show, I think this has been labeled a syndrome now. Isn't there something called the Truman Show syndrome now? Right? When we share a common language, when we're trying to explain something to someone, we want them to understand what we're saying, so we use terminology that we think they'll understand, right? If you want to explain something to someone who is blind from birth, you don't use color in your explanation, because he or she won't understand that. You find another way to explain, all right? So, for example, someone says this feels like the Truman Show. Well, they're not saying that they believe they're in the Truman Show. They're just using this as a, to explain, as a euphemism, as a metaphor, to explain what it feels like. But now, of course, that has been labeled a quote-unquote syndrome. And it is the government putting this out there. Okay? Because it is what it feels like. And I've never seen the Truman Show. I'm not going to watch it. But I understand the concept, and that is exactly what it feels like. So when we try to explain to someone, right, and this could be anything. Like, you tell someone that you have a million things to do today, you don't actually mean you have a million things to do today. You're trying to get across to the person that you have a lot to do, okay? You're swamped, right? And even that, right, you're not actually in a literal swamp, right? Any intelligent person knows that, but a crooked psychiatrist might call you delusional, right? No, you don't have a million things to do. You're overactive, overreactive, and no, you're not actually in a swamp. You're delusional, you're paranoid. even though he or she knows damn well what you meant. This is how out of context they can take things if they have a negative agenda. And I've seen this happen before. You have to watch everything you say, even euphemisms, even metaphors. It becomes impossible to explain anything. And that's the point. So you can't explain it then. Right? So they do this. The psychiatrists do this instead of even considering the reality of our world today. That with modern technology, criminals can use GPS devices to track a person's every move, hidden cameras to watch and listen to everything a person says or does in private, hack cell phones and computers to listen in on conversations and even watch the victim in real time. And perverse psychopathic stalkers who take that further and begin repeating to their victims everything they, the victims, said or did in private in order to create the maximum amount of fear. Okay, of course this exists. It's terrifying and it's real. And this technology, I mean, there is advanced technology that it would look supernatural to, even to most of us. Of course, it's not. But this technology is, we all know what this is. This technology is not so advanced that a person in charge of someone else's mental health should be unfamiliar with it, okay? Spy cameras and GPS trackers. Come on. And the nature of psychopaths is not so benign to assume that they wouldn't abuse technology and people to the greatest extent of their ability in order to cause the maximum amount of stress, anxiety, fear, pain, and trauma. Any psychiatrist should understand that. So this trigger factor among psychiatrists becomes even more dangerous when included among possible signs of mental illness is the denial that one is mentally ill. Yes, you heard that right. And I actually heard a psychiatrist make this statement on the news, claiming that one of the symptoms of mental disorder is the denial that one has a mental disorder. Now, I'm sure there are people who genuinely do suffer from mental illness and are in denial about it, but when this quote-unquote symptom is used with the general population, well, now what do? We can be accused of a mental disorder, and our very denial of such or attempt to prove it isn't true will be seen instead as proof that it is true. There is no way out of this terrible reasoning. And the psychiatrist who used it probably shouldn't even be practicing psychiatry if she is unaware of the situation that she just put the population in. Using reasoning like this, once you're accused of mental illness, you will be considered mentally ill and there's nothing you can do about it. Worse, any attempt you make to try and prove that this is untrue will only reinforce to the lemmings that it is true. Imagine if criminal cases were held this way, where denying your involvement in a crime is seen as proof that you actually committed the crime. Can you imagine? There's a reason I call a mental health diagnosis an accusation. First of all, having the label, being labeled with a mental illness will stay with and haunt a person for the rest of his or her life, especially if the person is labeled, incredibly volatile, violent, or, a possible threat. People who know about the diagnosis will treat the individual differently, and if the diagnosis is extremely volatile, people might even become hostile to the person, even driving him or her out of the community. In cases where the person is being followed around by someone who is telling everyone about the mental health diagnosis, or about, the false diagnosis, the poor falsely accused individual will not be able to stay in any one community for very long. They will begin treating him or her with caution, fear even, which might turn into hostility as he's used as a scapegoat for everything that goes wrong. His every move scrutinized and twisted into something negative. This is what happens when people believe that someone is bad or might pose a threat. They begin to see a threat in everything he or she does, no matter how innocent and benign. Eventually, the target is going to become angry and might even start returning hostility with hostility, at which point the community gets the self-fulfilled expectation they were waiting for, that the target is angry, hostile, and possibly violent. They're not bright enough to understand what a self-fulfilled expectation is, and sadly, the people who were put in charge of the mental health of others don't even seem to understand basic psychology. Cause and effect, action and reaction. They simply expect abuse victims to shut up and take it indefinitely and quietly and peacefully, right? Lie down like a doormat and never cry out. And if the victims fail to do this, their failure is used as further proof of their mental illness diagnosis. And of course, to they're punished for it. They're deemed bad and violent, and their warranted anger is used against them, and that almost becomes gaslighting, right? Ironically, abusers are typically let off the hook, as they are only doing what is natural, primal nature, that is, by running with a pack. Cowards. Eventually, the victim will be driven out of the community, possibly after having given them exactly what they expected, but were too stupid to understand they created. And of course, the victim's negative response will be used against him or her to prove the false beliefs of the community which were fed to them by a crooked psychiatrist, or whoever is going around blabbing about the psychiatric diagnosis. Right? Watch out for that guy, or watch out for that girl, that woman. A mental health worker, though, should understand the effects of long-term psychological abuse and isolation on the human psyche. How about trying to stop abusers from abusing instead of criminalizing abuse victims for showing signs of trauma? So the government and its mass media mouthpiece has been nothing more than a propaganda machine doing everything in its power to link mental illness to violent crime, and of course to trigger unwise mental health workers who can't escape herd mentality into believing that just about everyone is suffering from some form of mental illness. As I mentioned before, the red flags that mental health workers are taught to look out for not only include symptoms of severe and real trauma, but also everyday beliefs and customs that most people have at least once thought of or engaged in. In this manner, no one can prove their sanity. Right? You ever talk to a psychic? Have you ever considered the possibility that extraterrestrials are real? Are you into watching the History Channel? Okay. This goes in your file then. Okay, this is how bad it's getting. This way, they have something on everyone. So the people who do complain and do speak out about these things are automatically deemed mentally ill. Because at this point, the characteristics really include just about everyone. Are you afraid, anxious, scared of people? Do you believe you're being followed? That some omniscient force can see and hear you in private? Well then, in the mind of a mental health worker who has been conditioned to see these beliefs as signs of mental illness, you are mentally ill. It never occurs to the person that maybe this is actually happening. Also, he or she would have included in the question the belief in an omniscient power, so that if you answer yes to the question, you then end up with magical thinking tagged onto your diagnosis as well, even if you are fully aware that humans are doing this and using technology, not magic or the supernatural. It's another way to describe things. You say it feels like someone has omniscient powers and they're watching you. That's what the technology has allowed. It's technology, right? And that should be understood. Again, it's just another way of explaining something. But you say the wrong word, that shrink writes down the wrong diagnosis. But there's another side to it too. Many victims of this are also driven so insane that they do begin experiencing magical thinking. But again, a mental health professional must be able to see past that, to the actual crime being committed against the individual, instead of using that to justify the lie that there is no crime being committed and that it's all in the victim's head. Also, some of the questions they are given to assess people with might have multiple layers together, okay? Multiple questions asked as one question, so that if you answer yes or no to one, you answer yes or no to all. This is set up intentionally, and it is entirely manipulative. And again, it's not the mental health professional's fault. They're given a standard set of assessment questions to ask. They're given that by the government. Okay, they have to follow protocol. This is coming from a higher source, and I don't mean supernatural. Experiences that are natural and normal are sometimes coupled with the questions, in the questions, with experiences that really can be signs of mental illness. So, for example, someone might ask, if you see visions or see or or see things that others can't see, hear things in your head that others can't hear, or have ringing in your ears? That's the full question. Okay, folks, this is one question. Now, a lot of people have ringing in their ears. It's called tinnitus and is a very real physical problem. It's very common too. But if you experience this and want to be honest, and so that you answer yes, you have ringing in your ears, the answer to the entire question, all parts, is yes. You answer yes to one part, you answer yes to all parts. So not only is it documented that you have ringing in your ears, but also that you have visual and audio hallucinations. Do you see how that works? All three symptoms included in one question. Answer yes to one, you answer yes to all. And the same thing if you answer no. They do this on purpose, and I don't mean the mental health workers. They're just doing their job. It's the government that gives them the questions to ask and the guidelines to follow. Although you'd think that some would be bright enough to pick up on how unreasonable, irrational, and invalid this form of questioning is, you'd expect that from someone who's in charge of determining whether someone else is mentally healthy or not. I mean, you think that if they're working in a field, if they're working in a field that allows them to assess the minds of others, they'd at least be able to understand their own mind and see through something that is clearly false, including conditioning. They're being conditioned into false beliefs. But they accuse us of that. In fact, sometimes the psychiatrist is even more mentally disturbed than the people that he or she is diagnosing as mentally disturbed. Alas, just as the masses of lemmings who came before them, if someone with authority tells them that this is fine and good, they will do it, believing that they have done nothing wrong. And finally, we are coming to the end of this long video. Certain individuals outside of the government, and sometimes inside the government, if they're government employees, if they're in the military, it's easier for them to do this, unfortunately. Certain individuals do abuse both the mental health and legal systems, with mental health system and the legal system for their own selfish gain, which then leads to all of this being normalized. Shrinks being paid off, psychiatrists being paid off, people trying to have others diagnosed with mental illness in order to gain power and or money from the people diagnosed. Mental illness diagnosis used as a means of discrediting, disempowering, and even institutionalizing people, political opponents, rivals of any kind, ex-spouses, siblings. What about a sibling fight, right? Right? Or just some poor guy or gal who some psychopath has a grudge against. Okay, two things, money and power. This is usually abused for. That's what usually leads to abuse of these two systems, the mental health system and the legal system. Every single time a person does this and wins, it becomes more and more ingrained in our culture as a supposedly acceptable means of getting an enemy or rival out of the way. Just as it was used as a means of warfare not too long ago, sadly, with lobotomy being one consequence if someone was diagnosed with mental illness. This is why I say it is an accusation, because the consequences of that accusation are nothing short of punishment, and they can even be deadly. Never underestimate the potential. Never underestimate the potential weaponization and abuse of the psychiatric field. It has happened in the past, and it is happening again now.